We are in Acts chapter 12, and so this is this is one of Luke's just really one of his most charming vignettes. Kind of again, it ranks right up there with Peter's visit to Cornelius's house and the dream. There's in chapter 12, just like in chapter 10, there's a dream sequence and kind of a vision sequence, and then exactly, it's like Bill and Ted's, like they're in the news now, and so good old Peter, he's he kind of learns obedience once again, but it really is just a wonderful story about the church, and just told with a sense of humor, as we'll see, and so kind of Luke in his Acts of the Apostles, he gave the early patristic fathers of the church, really tried to, they addressed the question, is humor appropriate in church? They really, they kind of wrestled, is this really seemly? And Luke, the way that Luke tells story in Acts of the Apostles was taken as evidence that, yes, one could be humorous and still reverent at the same time. So they, of course, being patristic fathers, they reached out to Aristotle for proof as well. That a well-answered jest is a sign of intelligence, right? That was something to be valued in conversation amongst friends. So anyway, we'll go ahead and dive into chapter 12. So about that time, so we just covered. We have the church has gotten started in Antioch, and that was our last last week we did kind of a church beginning in Antioch. And so now about that time, King Herod laid violent hands upon some who belonged to the church. Now, this is the third King Herod that we meet in Luke's storyline, and basically the New Testament storyline. So the first King Herod is the King Herod at the time of Jesus's birth, right? So that was Herod the Great, right? The big builder. And then in the time of Jesus, you have the second Herod, his son, right? And then this Herod is now Herod Agrippa the first, who and so the middle Herod, as one could kind of detect from the gospel stories, was really not up to snuff. He was not nearly as talented politically as his father or his son. And so the middle Herod that we kind of, the feckless one that is, kind of sending Jesus back and forth between Pontius Pilate and Herod's household and Caiaphas, etc. So he passes from the scene, and now we get Herod Agrippa the first, who actually had his grandfather's political kind of acumen. He had a knack for survival, and so we're going to kind of see this at play as he goes about laying violent hands upon some who belong to the church. He had James, the brother of John, killed with the sword. So here we have in Luke's story, in a sense, what this introduces is kind of the charmed period of the apostolic church has really come to an end, right? Where the last time we kind of heard about the apostolic church in Jerusalem, Luke's narrative said, and the church was at peace. Well, the church is not at peace anymore, right? So Herod has laid violent hands on the church, and also this is the first one of the 12 who's killed. And so in a sense, this begins a process in which kind of Jesus's promise to his disciples that they would meet the 12, that they would meet the same fate, begins to come true. And so kind of the Holy Spirit had held the 12 harmless for, the earliest period of the church's life in Jerusalem. But now with James, brother of John, the spell breaks, and the first of the 12 is martyred. And in a sense, we have the answer to the question that Jesus posed to James, and who is, again, remember James and John, brothers, both sons of the sons of Zebedee, and the sons of thunder was their nickname. The ones who ask, can we sit on your right hand and on your left hand? And Jesus asked them the question, can you drink the cup from which I will drink? And in the end, we find that the answer for James is yes, that he does in fact drink from the same cup that Jesus drinks from, that he also is put to death on behalf of the mission of God in the world. Killing with the sword is a phrase which means basically a beheading, like John the Baptist. So it's so he is beheaded. It's interesting. There's a cultural difference here in the sense that in Rome, a kind of a professional beheading was a work of mercy, right? That was kind of like the humane way to be killed. So citizens of Rome would be beheaded, but the Jews felt that beheading was a particularly accursed way to die. It was right up there with being crucified. That basically the Jews of the Second Temple Judaism were very almost kind of literalistic about the resurrection of the body. So the body had to be kept together, right? And so a death where you separate one part of the body from the other, that was bad. It's like, and so he has John killed, beheaded in the way that John the Baptist or James beheaded, just like John the Baptist. And then Herod saw that it pleased the Jews. And again, now in Luke's narrative, he's now using the word the Jews in much the same way that John's gospel uses the term, has kind of the Pharisaic party. Although for Luke, it really is the Pharisaic party. And for John's gospel, the Jews are more the temple hierarchy. So the high priesthood are the Jews in John's gospel. For Luke, it's the Pharisees. Why? Well, in some ways, for Luke, remember, Luke is writing to a church that is in the Greco-Roman diaspora. And so in the diaspora, that was where the Pharisees lived, right? I mean, basically the diaspora was Pharisaic Judaism in exile. The temple authorities were concentrated right there in Jerusalem, right? So in a sense, so if you kind of, Judaism abroad was Pharisaic Judaism. So for Luke's kind of congregations, Pharisaic Judaism was the Judaism that they bumped up against in places like Thessalonica, Galatia, Rome itself, etc. So for Luke, that phrase has a very particular meaning, which is geared towards his own congregational audiences, if you will. So he noticed that it pleased the kind of the Pharisaic party, and we know from Josephus's history. Josephus was the Jewish general who's captured and then saves his own skin by writing a flattering history of the Jewish wars, in which it was really all the Jews' fault, and the Romans did him a favor by conquering them. So it really is one of those stories. And it worked. If you flatter Caesar enough, Caesar lets you live to flatter him more. If you prove good at that sort of task. So, and Josephus was right up for the task. So he wrote not just one, but two major histories in which the Romans come out looking very good. So Josephus tells us that Herod Agrippa was closely aligned with the Pharisaic party within Jerusalem against the temple authorities. So kind of as Herod was vying for power against the aristocracy, which is a common dynamic, right? So you have a monarch and then you have the aristocrats. And so usually, the monarch and the aristocrats kind of jostle for power and influence. And so he reached out to the Pharisaic party to kind of help him get over on the temple authorities. So, hey, this is pleasing the Pharisees. Let's do more of this, right? So he proceeded to arrest Peter also. This, in then kind of a parenthetical comment, this was during the festival of unleavened bread. Well, again, so Luke is telling a story that is volume 2 of a story he's told before. So, of course, this note about the time, the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, should bring to mind what, right? Jesus's own trial, right? So, Jesus is arrested and tried during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, aka Passover. So what Luke is doing here is he's signaling to the reader, I want you to be thinking about Jesus's trial and what happened in the Passover that Jesus endured and what's going to happen to Peter in this story. So when he had seized him, Herod put him in prison and handed him over to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending to bring him out to the people after the Passover. And the 4 squads of soldiers is like kind of an over the top. It's like one squad, basically each squad was made up of 4 soldiers, and to put 4 times 4, like 16 guys on Peter. That's just, what Luke is really doing is like he's just kind of pouring it on. It's like, boy, it's like and so remember, this is just like is supposed to be reminiscent of how they posted guards at the tomb, right? Yeah, fine, go post as many guards as you want. So they kind of overdo the guards. While Peter was kept in prison, the church prayed fervently to God. And this, just verse 5 is going to be so important to Luke's own understanding of the meaning of the story. Because in a sense, while Peter is under heavy guard, right, you might think, oh man, they're all in trouble. The power of Herod, the power of this world is they've got Peter under their thumb. It's hopeless, right? We're done for. It's kind of you kind of like Batman and Robin, and how Robin said, Batman, they've got us. The Penguins got us, and Batman usually says something reassuring. Robin, right? Although one of my favorite things of this is kind of a non sequitur, but one of my favorite things of Batman and Robin would say, one of my favorite exchanges is, Robin. I remember the old Adam West Batman, right, where Robin goes to says to Adam West Batman, "Batman will die," and Batman replies, "Or worse." So anyway, it was a great show. So while Peter is under the thumb of Herod and his troops, the church is praying fervently. And so again, this is going to set up, Luke is basically setting this up to show us who is in charge. Is Herod in charge, or is God in charge? And of course, we know the answer, but basically he is constructing this story, he's building this story to be an illustration of what's the true power in this world, right? What is the true power at this operating? And so here we have the church gathering to pray fervently to God for him. So in the midst of a seemingly powerless position within Jerusalem, the church is actually engaging in the most powerful thing it could do. It gathers and prays fervently. So let's see how God's going to answer these prayers. The very night before, and this is great storytelling, and really the Greek is very much in this sort of storytelling Greek. The very night before Herod was going to bring him out, Peter, bound with not 1, 2 chains. It's like you would think normally 1 chain would do, but no, they used 2 chains on Peter, was sleeping between 2 soldiers, not 1 soldier, 2 soldiers, right? 1 on each, so you have to imagine there's 1 soldier on each side of him, while guards in front of the door were keeping watch over the prison. Now, this is actually standard operating procedure for Roman prison detachments. So basically, those squads of 4 would work like this. So 2 were on at any one time. They would have shifts where 2 were on, 2 were off. And so the 2 that were off, it's not like they were allowed to go into the barracks and have some recreation, read books, watch TV, play the Nintendo. So even when you were off, you were stuck there guarding, your high value prisoner. So basically, it's in the middle of the night, and the 2 guards who are off duty are sleeping next to Peter, basically, and the 2 other guards are inside the cell, guarding the doors. Right. So that's kind of what we have. So that's the scene where that's being said here. We're keeping watch in front of the, oh, I'm sorry, they're on the other side of the door. So in front of the door, we're keeping watch over the prisoner. Behold, now in the NRSV it says suddenly, but actually it's idu. Behold, an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. Okay, so right away, I mean, we should be thinking angels and lights. This is Christmas. It's like, you know, like the shepherd is like, behold, I bring great tidings. And so this is all Luke. Again, his storytelling, he tells the stories in the same way. And the light shining in the cell, again, that links back multiple ways to the transfiguration, to the resurrection itself, to the men sitting in the tomb with shining garments. And so basically what the light inside the cell is supposed to signify is the divine presence. So God's presence comes into the prison cell. So remember, so that we're tracking with Jesus, right? And so the prison cell is a symbol of what? It's the tomb, right? So Jesus is Peter's in chains in the tomb, right? Just as kind of Jesus is in the chains of death inside the tomb. So Peter's in the prison cell, and then angels going to appear. A light shines in the cell. And now, again, in the NRSV, it says he tapped Peter on the side. Now, some of you may have different translations, but the word here is actually he smote him. He struck him. So basically, it's like, and this is humorous. So basically, you can imagine Peter is in a dead sleep. He's just absolutely zonked out. And basically, the angel comes and like kicks him, basically, kicks him in the side, like, wake up. I can imagine that maybe he started with tapping. It's kind of like a teenager, right? It's like time to go to, kind of get up and go to school. And so maybe it started with a tapping, but eventually it's like, okay, we're just going to, like one angel says, I think he's going to kick him. So finally they strike Peter on the side and woke him, saying, now again, you've been with me. If you've been with me in this class, you know how to translate this verse. Is it get up quickly? No, it's rise quickly, be raised, right? So again, this is resurrection time. This is Easter in another key, right? So we're doing Easter all over again. So rise quickly, and the chains fell off his wrists. The angel said to him, fasten your belt and put on your sandals. He did so. This is it. And so in this whole, as he tells the story, you're going to have this whole kind of dreamlike quality. It's like this vision, right? Remember the vision from chapter 10, where it's kind of like the thing goes down. So now Peter, good old Peter, has finally learned that when you have a vision and there's an angel, do what it tells you to do, right? It's like, don't question, don't say, far be it from me, Lord, I've never eaten anything unclean. Okay, so like Peter learned his lesson. So now when the angel tells him, right, get dressed. And again, it's just funny the way it's like you have these very specific, kind of instructions on getting dressed in the morning. I mean, so it says like, fasten your belt and put on your sandals. It's like, don't forget your shoes over there, Peter. It's like, you're going to be walking for a while. So he did so. Then the angel said to him, wrap your cloak around you and follow me. Peter went out and followed him. And so the Greek is really in this very kind of mirrored way, so the language kind of mimics, it really is supposed to be this kind of story, kind of almost, it's kind of this dreamlike sort of quality. So he went out and followed him. He did not realize that what was happening with the angel's help was real. He thought he was seeing a vision. It's kind of like Peter's given up hope. He's like, okay, I'm going to be killed tomorrow, and this must be God telling me that everything's going to be okay, right? It must be some sort of vision to help encourage me, right? So he's playing along. He's just doing whatever the angel tells him. After they had passed the first and second guard, so so the guard in his cell, so it's like out of these 4 detachments, right? So they walk past. So he's got one in his cell. They walk past the next one, walk past the next one. They came before the iron gate leading into the city. So here's this is the equivalent in the story to the stone over the tomb, right? And so this is when this is iron gate. This is just like in your yard where you just kind of open a swing gate. This is the fortress gate, right, to Herod's palace. This is an enormous door which is shut tight at night, right? So I mean, this is no small little gate. This is a gate to a fortress. It opened for them spontaneously. Another translation could be of its own accord, but I like basically the Greek can mean the same thing. Basically, it spontaneously opened for them, and they went outside and walked along the lane when suddenly the angel left him. Then Peter came to himself and said, "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hands of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." So Peter nicely interprets the narrative for you. So it's like he's like, oh, so that's what's happened. Here I am out here. Basically, he's in an alleyway, kind of close by the fortress, where the angel says, "Okay, Peter, you can take it from here." And in a sense, this is the way that I think God often works in our lives, right? In a sense, God will bring us to a certain point and say, okay, now you need to work it, right? I've gotten you this far. Now you're going to have to kind of come to yourself and kind of get to work. And so Peter goes off and goes to find the church. As soon as he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark. So right there. So here is John Mark, and this is Luke's wonderful way. You've seen already how Luke would likes to introduce characters before they come into the action. And so John Mark is going to be coming on board the mission team of Paul and Barnabas later in the story. So this is a great way to introduce John Mark in the story, but also it gives historians, kind of scholars of the church, a fascinating window into just how dominated the apostolic church was by kinship systems, right? So we know we have the help of some of Paul's letters. And in Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, we find out that John Mark is a nephew of Barnabas. So Barnabas, he's got family there in Jerusalem, and John Mark is his nephew. That would make Mary his sister, right? And so Peter goes to a church, this kind of a house church, probably for Hellenistic Jews, right? Those Greek-speaking Jews that Barnabas got set aside to help, and Philip, etc. And so these Greek-speaking Jews, and from Cyrene, from Cyprus, where Barnabas is from, and so Peter heads there. And what is the church doing when Peter's sleeping? Peter was in a hard sleep. But what has the church been doing all this time? Many had gathered and were praying. Ta-da, right? So in a sense, Luke is this wonderful story of the church at work. What does the church do when it seems like the powers of this world are on full display and seem to be in charge? Well, basically, gathering for prayer vigils is something that Luke tells us the very earliest church did. People coming together, lighting candles, and praying into the night on behalf of someone who is suffering and on behalf of an injustice. This is what the church does. This is in our very DNA, to gather and to pray for those who are unjustly incarcerated. And so the gathering for prayer is really an essential mark of the church, as far as Luke is concerned. Remember that Luke, of all the gospel writers, Luke is the one who tells us again and again and emphasizes that Jesus would go by himself to pray. Right? So that Jesus in Luke, Jesus always has little spiritual retreats, and so here, what Luke is showing us is that the church, the apostolic church, was following the example that Jesus set. in terms of developing its own life of prayer and withdrawing to prayer. And in that prayer comes the true power of the church, right? Because look, the prayers have been answered. So here they are praying, and their prayers have been answered. Now here comes a really funny story, a really funny part of the story. Now, when Peter knocked at the outer gate, a maid named Rhoda came to answer. On recognizing Peter's voice, she was so overjoyed that instead of opening the gate, she ran in and announced that Peter was standing at the gate. They said to her, "You're crazy," or more formally, "You're out of your mind." But she insisted that it was so. They said, "It's his angel," or a ghost. Meanwhile, Peter continued knocking. Good old Peter, so he's escaped from prison. He's out there in the street. He's kind of like, let me in, gosh darn it. Let me in. It's like he's looking over his shoulder. It's like, are you guys going to snatch, a defeat out of the jaws of victory? I mean, I'm almost here and you don't let me in. And again, in the background, Luke, like John, wants you to know that in some ways, whereas John has the breakfast with the breakfast on the Sea of Galilee is Peter's rehabilitation from the 3 denials at the house of Caiaphas, and Peter says he loves Jesus 3 times. Well, when we look at a place with a courtyard and an outer gate with a maid, remember what happened in Caiaphas? It was a maid, right, at Caiaphas' house who recognized Peter and said, "Aren't you the guy that was with Jesus?" Right? And so here we have, again, a maid who confronts Peter in the outer courtyard of a house, and she recognizes who Peter is, right? And Peter kind of saying, "Yes, it's me," but no one believes him now. Whereas before he said, I don't know who he is. I don't know any, that's not me. And so it's this kind of recapitulation of that event in the courtyard, except now with Peter standing on the outside and banging on that gate. And when they opened the gate, they saw him and were amazed. He motioned them with his hand to be silent. It's like, keep it down. You're going to wake everybody in the neighborhood. I mean, it's really just such a wonderful, wonderful story. All these details. And the thing is, you can really identify with the human emotion of all the people in the narrative. And again, that's part of Luke's narrative goal, is that he doesn't present a church that's unbelievable, right? He presents a church with real people who do silly things, right? Like leaving Peter at the gate to go tell people it's Peter's at the gate instead of just letting him in. And so they announced. Going back again, this is it's another resonance with the Easter story. Remember how the women go to the tomb and they see the tomb is empty, and they come back and they tell the apostles or the disciples, he's not there. He's been raised. We saw Jesus, and he said that meet him in Galilee. And they said to the women, it's an idle tale, right? And so once again, you have this. And again, Peter was one of the guys who probably said that. And so here's Rhoda coming. It's like, Peter's at the gate. And they're like, "Oh, you're crazy. You're crazy." And then it is his angel. This is kind of a fascinating window into kind of beliefs of the early church about, how they spoke about people who had died. So basically, the other thing that they're thinking is maybe he's already been killed in the prison. And basically, it's his ghost. It's an angel. It's his messenger, which is the word for angel, is the word for angel's messenger. And again, it's also a play on the fact that real angels came to break Peter out of prison. And so well, no, it's not Peter's angel. He was helped by angels, but it really is Peter in flesh and blood standing at your gate. And so they finally wrap their head around the fact that he's there. He motions them with his hand to be silent, and he described for them how the Lord had brought him out of the prison. And so he he doesn't just run away. He takes the opportunity to give a testimony. It's like, so let me tell you the story. And again, and Luke doesn't, again, you would think it'd be consistent with what Luke has done before to have another chapter where Peter re-narrates the entire sequence of events, like he did at Cornelius' house. But we know that this is something that Peter would do, right? It's like, let me tell you about what just happened to me. And so he tells them about what just happened to him. And then he added, tell this to James and the believers. Now, this is not the James that has been beheaded in the beginning of the chapter. This is James, brother of the Lord. And what we have here, what Luke is signaling to us here, is very much the formal transfer of authority in the Jerusalem church to James, because Peter is getting out of Dodge, right? So this is the beginning of Peter's missionary journeys, which eventually bring him to Rome. And James, the brother of our Lord, is going to stay at Jerusalem and become a leader of the church. And this is actually, and so not only does this back up Paul's essential testimony about James, right? So Paul talks in the letter to Galatians about how he had checked in with James and met with James in the Jerusalem church. Also, he mentions James, the brother of the Lord, in 1 Corinthians 15, as someone who was a witness of the resurrection. So Luke here backs up Paul's basic account of James, and also we have it attested. James's leadership of the church is also attested by Josephus, and so Josephus relates the martyrdom of James, brother of our Lord, at the hands of Herod later, much closer to the revolt, the Jewish revolt. And so so we do have, again, extra biblical, kind of secular, if you will, kind of evidence for James being in charge of the church. And so again, the existence of the early church, the apostolic church, is attested by independent sources who describe, Josephus mainly, who describe kind of the events in Jerusalem leading up to the rebellion against Rome. So tell this to James and to the brothers. Then he left and went to another place. And this kind of, again, this just tantalizing. It's like, look, what other place? Where'd he go? We want to know. So we will find out again, and we know from Paul's letters that Peter spent time at Antioch, at Orontes, that we talked about before. So again, it has a mate, so if you're not gonna be in Jerusalem, you might as well go to the next biggest city of Jews, which would be, Antioch and Orontes, just down, kind of just down the coast a little bit. And then we also know that Peter spent time in Corinth, because if you remember from 1 Corinthians chapter 2, Paul says, Paul makes fun of the factions within Corinth and said, some people say I'm an Apollos guy, and other people say I'm a Peter guy, and other people say I'm a Paul guy, and other people say I'm a Jesus guy, and basically he makes fun of all that factionalism. And so we have that sort of evidence that Peter spent time in Corinth, clearly, and evidently baptized people in Corinth, and then ultimately wound up in Rome. So anyway, so off goes Peter. So Peter has leaves the building. Although he will come back briefly in chapter 15. So it's like he hasn't quite left yet. So we think he probably went down to Antioch, and then he comes back later in chapter 15. So picking up the story. So, and then this is kind of a humorous. It has a bad ending for some people in the story, but it's also part of Luke's sense of humor. When morning came, there was no small commotion. And this is one of Luke's favorite phrases. He loves it. In Greek, it's called a litotes. It's the rhetorical technique of understatement, right? So it's like no small commotion, in the fortress among the soldiers over what had become of Peter. I can imagine there was no small commotion. When Herod had searched for them, or for Peter, and could not find him, now the NRSV puts this politely, examined the guards. Now, what do you suppose that means? He interrogated the guards. It means he tortured the guards. It's like because again, from Herod's point of view, it must have been an inside job, right? How did this guy, you had one job. You got guys sleeping on the floor next to a guy in chains. You got one job. Stay sleeping there next to the guy in chains. And somehow he gets out of the room. Somebody must have been bribed. So he tortures all the guards, and this would be kind of standard procedure. Again, in Roman, for example, in Roman legal proceedings, we always like to think of Romans as a people of the law. The very kind of the legalistic people. But in Roman legal proceedings, typically the accused, people who were accused, and even some witnesses would basically be kind of warmed up a little bit by a little light torture before the proceedings even begin. The psychological theory, and this was a psychological theory, like they're philosophers and people who wrote about such things. Their theory was people would tell the truth if they were in pain. Like, that basically if you were in pain, you were predisposed to tell the truth. Of course, as we found out from the experience of our CIA, actually people will tell you anything when they're in pain, and like to get out of just tell me what you want, I'll tell you everything. But the Romans felt that if you were in pain, you told the truth. So basically everybody got tooled up a little bit, before questioning. So this would be standard operating procedure. So he interrogated the guards and ordered them to be put to death. Actually the literal meaning of the Greek is to order them to be taken away. And of course, there's only one place you go when you get taken away, right? Send them to the corn patch, Billy. If you remember that Twilight Zone show. So it's like, you get taken away. There's only one place to get taken to. So then Herod went down from Judea to Caesarea, which would be Caesarea Maritima, on the seashore, which would be a major Roman city, and he stayed there. Okay, so far so good. So Peter's escaped. Those mean, nasty guards have met their end. And again, people's like, oh, why do those guards have to die? Well, I don't know how you feel about torturers themselves being tortured, but it's kind of like, it's not to say that the Bible has the doctrine of karma in it, but there is the idea that evil devours itself. I mean, if you read the Psalms, right, that basically the wicked are trapped in their own snares. They fall into the pit that they themselves have dug, is another line from the Psalms. So it's kind of, there is this idea that God's justice does contain within it a certain amount of people kind of falling, being hoisted by their own petard, so to speak. And so the same will now be true with Herod. So let's find out. So again, you have Peter's arrested, and then he is freed. Now Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. So they came to him in a body, and after winning over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they asked for a reconciliation because their country depended on the king's country for food. Well, Luke, being a good narrator, he already told us, remember, that there was a famine in the area, and so Saul and Barnabas took up a collection amongst the saints to bring to Jerusalem. So he's already kind of given us the breaking news that there is a famine in the region. So here's another consequence of that famine. So these people basically depend on the grain fields of Judea for the grain fields of Galilee, actually, to feed them. And so they want an audience. So on an appointed day, Herod put on his royal robes, took a seat on the platform, and delivered a public address to them. The people kept shouting, "The voice of a God and not of a man." Immediately, because he had not given the glory to God, an angel of the Lord, oh, those angels, and he smote them. Now, the same angel who smote Peter, right? It's like there's a lot of smiting going on. So, but this time it's not for your good. It's not to wake you up, but it's to put you down. And so the angel of the Lord smote him, and he was eaten by worms and died. Oh, dun, dun, dun. There you go, Herod. That's what you get. So you might think, oh, surely Luke has embellished this tale. The fact is that this same incident is described by Josephus in even more over-the-top terms. So actually, compared to Josephus's recital of the event, Luke is restrained. So this is something that really did happen, in a sense that we have both Luke and Josephus testifying to the end of Herod Agrippa I. And so what happened, so if you kind of add in Josephus's account, he was meeting in some sort of public venue, and he came out in the royal robes, and now Luke attributes the crowd's acclamation to the speech that Herod made. Josephus says that just his robes, and he basically, this is the theater of kind of Greco-Roman politics. So he came out evidently in the full sun, and in these gold robes, and kind of purple and gold, and basically the sun shone on him. He came out on the patio at just the right time. The sun shone, and he radiated light from his clothing. And so the crowd started chanting, a god, not a man, a god, not a man. It's like, hooray for Herod. And so both Josephus and Luke basically attribute Herod's the fact that Herod did not immediately shut down this impious sycophancy, that God immediately punished him. Now Luke says immediately. Josephus says that Herod at the moment doubled over with stomach pains and then died 5 days later. So Josephus also adds the detail about the worms. So basically what we think was happening as we piece together is that there was some sort of internal thing that basically of sharp abdominal pains and some sort of gangrenous injury or gangrenous sore that attracted maggots and flies. And so that basically the worms are maggots. And so Josephus goes into some detail about how, Herod was still alive while the maggots ate him and all this. Both Luke and Josephus kind of rubbed their hands together at the horrible fate that came to Herod Agrippa. But the fact is that this, just to say that although this sounds, oh, right, whatever, we actually have this attested that this is how Herod Agrippa died. And so you can choose whether or not how you think that came about, but you have, these two independent sources testifying essentially to the same event. And again, for Luke, what this means again is essentially a triumphalistic note about how that little old church praying on its knees, holding his prayer vigil, got their guy out of Herod's prison, and Herod wearing his royal robes, and basically was willing to pretend that he had the power of God, was shown, to be very much a mortal, right? And was given his comeuppance. So that's kind of Luke's sort of the moral to Luke's story. And so then to complete the victory of the church over Herod and all his forces, the word of the word of God continued to advance and gain adherents. So it's kind of like, meanwhile, while Herod was, about to meet his nasty fate, the church was growing right under his nose and gaining adherents. Then, after completing their mission, and again, the word for mission is diakonia. So after completing their diakonia, Barnabas and Saul returned to either to or from. Again, manuscripts differ on whether they returned to Jerusalem, and so this is an anticipation somehow of chapter 15, or they returned from. I think it's from. And again, this just shows you how sometimes biblical translation and these manuscripts are not, 100%, certain. That is, again, it's the difference between ek and ice. So ek would be from, they return from, it kind of like they go from Jerusalem, or ice, which is they return to Jerusalem. And so you can imagine how a little E and a K, or an E and an I and an S in the script could be easily mistaken by a scribe. And so some of the manuscripts have ek and some of the manuscripts have ice. In the end, it doesn't matter a whole lot. But I favor the translation return from Jerusalem, because that just sets up chapter 13, which takes us to Antioch. The action shifts to Antioch. So they returned from Jerusalem and brought with them John, whose other name was Mark. Ah, there he is. So we have a new character in the story. And then chapter 13 starts with now in the church at Antioch, where they had come back to. They came from Jerusalem to Antioch, and so the story continues from there. But so you can decide if you want to scratch out. I haven't, in my Bible, I have it scratched out. So I scratched out 2, and I was like, it's like from. But you can decide how you fall on that scholarly debate. But anyway, so in a sense, the kind of Peter's out of Jerusalem. Saul and Barnabas are out of Jerusalem. Jerusalem has a center of, in a sense, of the action of the Holy Spirit is starting to shut down, right? James gets killed. Apostles are leaving. And so, again, this is Luke's way of saying kind of the action is starting to move outward, just like Jesus said it would at the beginning of the book, where he said, you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth. So we're starting to really shift. And if you think about it kind of with Peter, again, Peter comes in for a cameo appearance in chapter 15, but really chapter 12 marks the end of Peter's really dominating involvement. And, in a sense, you could kind of, in some, like in my Bible, there's kind of an extra big space between the end of chapter 12 and the beginning of chapter 13, because you really do have the sense that you could almost call chapters 1 through 12 the Acts of Peter. I mean, that Peter is such a dominating character at so many different junctures that the first third of the book, or nearly half of the book, are really about Peter. But now the leadership is going to shift to Luke's mentor, Paul, and his companions. And by the way, when you come up against that phrase, and we'll see that later, but he uses the phrase Paul and his companions, and that is something that Luke would have gotten from Greek literature, where it described, Alexander and his companions, right? Basically this is for Luke, and you can imagine Luke has a young man joining this group, and from Luke's point of view, he was in a cohort of heroes, right? He was with, those guys were just the sun, the moon, and stars. So, okay, so question, so how far apart in time were Luke and Josephus's accounts? Basically they were roughly contemporary. So we think Luke is writing in the mid to late 70s AD. So kind of shortly after the fall of Jerusalem. And so that's when, and so Josephus is taken captive in the caves, in the Dead Sea area, where kind of some of the guerrilla fighters, Jerusalem is lost, and so some of them flee, some of them go to Masada and are wiped out in Masada, and so Josephus was in a group that hid out in a cave. Of course, the Romans found them, because the Romans were determined. They're like, okay, if you're going to rebel, we're just going to hunt down every single last one of you, and so they did, he's with Pompey. He gets actually captured before the fall of the city as the Romans were mopping up the regions and kind of bottling everybody up. And so he was with Pompey in the siege of Jerusalem outside the city. And that's where he kind of starts this writing career of, royal flattery. Anyway, so that's so they're roughly contemporary, actually. So in verse 11, the Jewish people, same as the beginning of 12, the leadership of the temple. Verse 11. Oh, right. So yes, so the Jewish people, right, that's a good point. So this is actually now used in a somewhat more expansive way. So in a sense, what you have here is the Jews would be the Pharisees, and now the Jewish people would be, in a sense, the population of Jerusalem that seems to be kind of against the now hostile to the church, that is kind of on the side of Herod, and now in a more persecuting relationship with the church. So that is kind of an expansion, that Jerusalem is starting to get more and more kind of hostile to the church. Whereas in the early days, of course, if you remember, they had the goodwill of all the people. But now, in a sense, the church has grown to the point where they've become a noticeable minority. And they've come to the attention of other power structures within Jerusalem. And so once you do that, you're no longer harmless. And so people are going to start kind of mobilizing against you if they find you a threat. So good question. Yeah, that's another use of that phrase. All right, so any other questions about chapter 12? Okay. Well, again, it's one of those delightful stories, and I find it remarkable that Luke has so many of them about Peter when he followed Paul around, and so you imagine that again in Rome. I mean, my imagination, my kind of historical imagination, is that so after the tradition is that Paul is executed before Peter, and so. And so, he goes to Rome with Paul, and then he's in Rome and has the opportunity to get to know Peter while he's there and kind of hear from Peter and his experiences and stories, which he puts into his book that he's researched. But again, it's really clearly Peter was somebody that we don't have as strong, like with Paul, with all his letters, you can really kind of put together between Acts of the Apostles and his letters, you can really put together, and people have kind of, with varying degrees of satisfaction, a profile of Paul as a person. And Peter, we kind of miss that. We have the stories from the Gospels and this, but clearly Peter is somebody that the hand of the Lord, kind of God really messed with this guy. I mean, he was on an adventure. He's a fisherman, right? As I said in today's sermon, he's the kind of guy who goes out on a big lake in a small boat. Not the smartest plan of action to make a living that way. So, no life jackets or Coast Guard, right? I mean, so, you're out there on your own. And so Peter is clearly someone who was willing to go where the Lord pushed him sometimes, but he was obedient in the end, and he had a heart that was willing to follow wherever the angels would lead him. And so I think for us and that's the side of Peter that we sometimes forget, because Peter is often the symbol of the institutional Roman church, right? It's kind of the keys of Peter and the see of Peter in Rome. And so we kind of think of Peter as, that's about structure and authority, and he's the rock, and he's the one who's, can bind and loose, and, Jesus put him in charge. And to really, we sometimes lose the appreciation for Peter, who was someone who was willing to step out, right? And willing to risk and to follow where he was being called to go. And all that institutional stuff came way after his death. And I just have to think that maybe Peter the fisherman might have been disappointed. In some ways, like Martin Luther would have been disappointed to find an entire denomination or several named after him, because he didn't want that. He wrote he didn't want that himself. He just thought he was doing church, right? He didn't think he was doing Lutheranism. He wasn't trying to invent Lutheranism. And any more than Calvin was trying to invent Presbyterianism. So Peter wasn't trying to invent the institutional church. He was just trying to be faithful. So, I just commend to you, as we are kind of our takeaways from chapter 12, is first of all to remember the power of prayer, that the prayer is the most powerful force in the world because it connects us with the creator of the world. And so that when we are faced with the powers of this world, that we're called to join together in prayer. And also, finally, to be willing to, when God kind of smacks you awake in your life, and there are times, a season in our life where we've been kind of somnolent. And, and sometimes God just needs to kind of smite us in the side and kick us awake. And when God does that to you, listen and do what he tells you to do. Put on your shoes. Put on those walking shoes and be ready to follow where he will lead you, because it will be a place of life.